So I said I'm going to give you a Christchurch market update, and normally I do a whole lot of slides and do a whole lot of metrics, but to be honest, I was buried in due diligence on a deal today, and I thought, well, there's one slide that says it all. The blue line is Auckland, the green line is Wellington, and the orange line is Hamilton. And Christchurch's property market update is nothing has changed, and that's wonderful, because if you've watched any of our other webinars, and this stuff's on our website, you want to buy at 6 o'clock, not at 9 or 10 or 11 or 12. And sometimes it still makes sense to buy at those time frames if we use the property clock as our guide to where market's at, being low or high. 6 is low, 12 is high. Christchurch has been flat for too long, and there's a bunch of reasons that I'm going to go through tonight. That's the market update. It's going to go up. It's not if, it's when. And I can't put that in writing in an unconditional contract to you, but what I can do is bet the silverware on it. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't buy in other locations, but it means that right now I cannot fathom Christchurch not getting capital growth in the coming years, because property is not this week or this month. And this COVID-19, I'm not even going to talk about it tonight, except to say, even if it was a year, and it's not because of the government's swift action, but even if it was a year, it wouldn't change the metrics in locations like Christchurch, or infill housing in Auckland, or infill housing in Hamilton. Property is one of these great businesses where there's no better time to invest than now. And the two most common questions we're getting right now is, should we wait for a discount? And I go, yeah. I got offered a 20% discount yesterday. And but it's not a property you'd buy, because it's not an investment property. Great home, but not an investment property. And people are often tempted by the deal. And sometimes our deals don't get discounts because we know they're going to sell, and we know they're really good, and the vendor doesn't need to discount them. So property is not about screwing the last dollar out of someone. It's actually about identifying the right deal, and that's investment property. If it's your home, hey, you might want to get a bargain so that when you sell it, you can make a capital gain. No problem. But you've got to put up living with a property that might not be perfect for you, or you may have just got a great deal. But in the world of investment sales, most vendors are not desperate, and they've got, especially our business, decent balance sheets, and they are there for the long term. So, yeah, don't be led to believe that if there's a great discount, or if the deal sounds too good to be true, it could be. We get excited about our deals, but at the same time, we've done a lot of homework. So Christchurch right now is, in my opinion, stupidly low in value, and that's the median sale price there. And if you can't read that slide, Christchurch median sale price is around about that $420,000 to $30,000 mark. No, it's a bit higher than that. Sorry, it's 4. I haven't got the numbers in front of me. It's in the 4s, whereas Hamilton has now hit the 6s. Wellington's into the 8s, and Auckland's still over the $1 million. So even if you're not a finance person, that ain't rocket science when Christchurch is New Zealand's second largest city. Okay, so let's go back in time. This is back to the future, or back to the past and then to the future. In 2011, 80% of Christchurch's CBD was destroyed or demolished, 80%. And that is a photo of the minutes after the earthquake. And what you can't see there is that most of those buildings in that picture were subsequently pulled down. A couple fell down, but most of them were pulled down. And the devastation, to be put in context, 80%. And the CBD of Christchurch is, I'm going to show you a map of it in a minute. And what happened after that, the government, the council, government organisations got very involved in rebuilding Christchurch, because as New Zealand's second largest city, it was seen as a very, very obviously important biggest centre. It's the gateway to the South Island. So they came up with a central city recovery plan, and part of that was going out to the people to find out what they wanted. And David, just can you make a note? We need to put this on our website. It's a very good document, and They went out to the people and they said, what do you want for your city? Tell us what you want. They received over 100,000 suggestions and somehow collated those. And how often does a city get to do that? How often do people get to dictate, decide, contribute to what their city is going to be? And it was an amazing process. 100,000 people contributed to that. I mean, I just find that 20% of the population, just under 20% of the population. That's amazing. They went overseas. It's, you know, if you ever had an opportunity for full democracy in the world of cities, this was it. And this is the download. It's called Christchurch. If you Google it, you can download it yourself. It's called the Christchurch Central Recovery Plan. And this is obviously not for the whole of Canterbury. This was the central area. And in this document, back in 2000, I think it came out in 2012. It might have been in 2011 because the major earthquake was in February 2011. They collated this information and they said, this is our blueprint. And it was an amazing process to watch. We've been involved in the rebuild. I moved to Christchurch last year, but we've been involved in the rebuild since 2012 or 13. So I've seen it go from the demolition. I was here when the army was on the ground. So I've seen it from the start to today. I wasn't here for that tragic day, but I've seen it firsthand being built. Been involved with a lot of projects in Christchurch and a lot of rebuild in Christchurch. And if I had to make a guesstimate in terms of where the rebuild's at, I reckon it's about 75% finished. We are definitely at the tail end of it. And yeah, I strongly recommend that you download that document. So this is now jumping into the devil in the detail. One of the amazing things that the government did, and they're doing it now with COVID-19, they committed the country's resources to rebuilding Christchurch. And they committed to funding, facilitating, fast tracking 17 major infrastructure projects. And when I say 17 major, this is not commercial, this is not private developers, this is the government, the council, and the organisations that were created to rebuild the city. And they're all within the 4 avenues of Christchurch. And if you look at Christchurch, I think this map is 18 something. It's a very flat city. It's a very straightforward city. If you're driving down any street in Christchurch and stick your compass on, you'll notice that it's going to be pointing perfectly north, perfectly south, perfectly east, or perfectly west. They didn't get too architectural when they decided to carve up Christchurch, and they've taken some of these roads out. But back in the day, Christchurch was decided to look like a maths book of squares and straight lines. And if we look at it at the time back then, it was a home to 560,000 residents, and it contributed 12% of the country's GDP. So you can understand why the government was pretty keen to make sure it was looked after. Now, population has increased since then, and it's now larger than Wellington. So Christchurch it's not a tin pot town. So the whole 80% of the CBD being destroyed facilitated these infrastructure projects to have locations. And that's not to be sneezed upon, because land in most cities is not available. But in the face of tragedy and adversity and stress and all the horrible things that people had to go through in those early years, what it did, it freed up land, and it also gave the government, council, economy an ability to start again. Now, one of the reasons Christchurch is so cheap today is that the land values in the city were reset. They were re-established. And not only were they reset and re-established, they were rebuilt. So land repatriation, or fixing of the land, had to happen before you could build anything. So every new property since 2011 in Christchurch, that's 9 years ago, is on brand new land or It's got a foundation solution that deals with the issues with the type of earthquake that hit in 2011. So let's just go through a few of these infrastructure projects. The convention centre, 475 million. It's nearly complete from an outside point of view. This is a huge project right in the middle of town. That's going to bring a lot of events, a lot of conferences, a lot of trade shows. It's going to bring so much commerce to the city. And tragically, the Auckland conference venue was massively damaged in a fire last year, or this year. It was this year. That's actually good news for Christchurch, because these delegations need somewhere to go that can host lots of people. And, this will become the icon for the country once it's complete. And they're already taking booking. They've been taking bookings for a long time. It's nearly finished. The stadium, 470, so I put Metro Sports Centre there. This is the stadium. Rugby, singing, football. This is going to be one of only 2 covered stadiums in the country. And the specifications for it look far more, if Dunedin's got the only other covered stadium, but if Dunedin's economy class, this isn't business class, this is first class when you look at what they're going to do with it. So it's pretty cold watching sport at night in Christchurch or Dunedin or Wellington or Auckland even. So how many people, if they're going to go to one test in a series of 3, where are you going to go? So this will bring tourists, it'll bring people, and they've left it till last because it's an extremely luxury item when you think about music and sport, but it's also an important part of New Zealand's makeup, especially rugby. But they'll play football here like they do in Wellington, and other sports, rugby league. It'll be a real icon for a lot of sports, and I'd say it'll become the pick, the number 1 destination for touring teams like the Lions or any internationals that come to New Zealand, and it'll make the other cities pick up their boots, no pun intended, to get their stadium sorted. So watch this space when that's finished. The actual Metro Sports Complex has started. It's $300 million build. And to put this in context, that image does not do it justice. That just looks like the Kilburnie Pool in Wellington. But when you look at it here, that is 2 blocks. And to see the size of this complex, and that's Cagley Park to the left, that gives you an idea how big it is. And I can look out my window and see the crane, and I live in Maryvale. I can see the crane for that complex from our house. It is a huge, huge piece of land, and it's a massive complex. And the families that I speak to, that I hang out with, we can't wait to get there with the kids, and not little kids. This complex is being built for big kids and little kids. So it's going to be a real icon of entertainment for sporting going people. Turanga, the $92 million library. And they haven't called it a library because it's not a library. It's far more than that. If you're ever in Christchurch, please go into this building. It is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. And you can join this building for free. You get a library card and an access card. It's amazing. It's got a cafe on the ground floor. You can do your own film in here. It's really, really iconic. And even though it is the Library of Christchurch as well, but it's far more than that. It's got so many things you can do there. But it looks like a bookcase there with its golden colour. And that's finished. That's complete. It's been complete for some time. Bus interchange, $53 million. I had someone in the car the other week before lockdown, and I said to them, what do you think that building there is? And they said, it looks like a space design centre, or they thought it was some sort of museum. And I said, that's the bus station. $53 million bus station. The bus backs in undercover, so when you get off the bus, you don't get wet. It's got cafes, it's got seating areas, smack bang in them. It's got a movie theatre across the road. It makes Britomart look a little bit old-fashioned. So smaller projects, the Margaret Mahey Playground, $20 million. It's amazing. And not just for little kids, teenagers hang out here. It's got flying foxes, and it's got all sorts of things. And there's a new pump track next door, right on the river, right in the middle of town. Very cool. So I could keep talking on, another 11 amazing buildings being built or all complete already. But these go back to how this relates to property. Well, they bring people, first to build them, but then people stay. They bring jobs, they bring tourists. And whilst we're not flying around the world at the moment, it will open up again. But it'll also bring New Zealand tourists and from afar. They bring business spending for commercial outlets, retail outlets and hotels. And one of the other reasons that Christchurch has stayed flat is that the population isn't finished yet. It hasn't come. But the population is greater than it was before the earthquake, so Christchurch has grown. But proportionately to the rest of the country, it hasn't grown because we haven't had the housing, we haven't had the jobs, and that is increasing all the time. And that's one of the other reasons to buy in Christchurch now before it's full. Within the 4 Avs, they estimate right now there's about 7,000 permanent residents within the 4 Avs. That forecast is to go to 20,000. So it's going to triple. And the only comparison I can experience in that space, when I got moved to Hong Kong in the 80s, it always just seemed full. But it went from 5.5 million people to 7 million people, but I didn't notice it. Whereas when I moved to Wellington in my 20s, you could walk down Lambton Quay or Willis Street on the weekend and skateboard down the middle of the road. There was no cars, there was no people. It was a ghost town because at that time there were 200 head offices and government businesses. There were no inner city apartments. They hadn't started. They started in the 90s when they started converting commercial office space to apartments, and then started building new apartments. So in the 90s in Wellington there was no apartment CBD. It was very different. And if I look at Christchurch now, it reminds me of where Wellington was probably in the middle of the 90s, because it actually has got a vibrant CBD and it has got people living there and it has got people enjoying it. Whereas Wellington was just a ghost town, and now it's like New York, it's like Manhattan. This is where it's these buildings actually are the core and the base of bringing people, jobs, commercial spending. They also bring a heart and soul, and whilst I'm a Cantab, I've actually spent most of my life in the North Island. And I love Wellington. My son's at Victoria University. Some of my nearest and dearest friends and family, my father's there, my cousin's there, my 2 cousins actually. And Wellington and the Wairarapa will always be a very, very special place in my heart. But Christchurch, this has been the easiest move for me I've ever had in my whole moving around time. I've fallen well back in love with this city. I'm arguing with my wife all the time about moving back out to Sumner Redcliffs. But we've got kids at school just around the corner, so that's not happening anytime soon. But it is a beautiful city, and that's why they called it the Garden City. And when you get to rebuild something like that, that's pretty cool. So let's quickly jump to the economic argument. Forget my emotions and love story with Christchurch. The jobs that I said, businesses, that's all real. And whilst a lot of those retailers are empty at the moment, not even before COVID-19, it's because the population isn't here yet. But those buildings ain't going anywhere because they're brand new and they're finished. But let's look at the economic argument of supply and demand. I call it Economics 101. You know, there's a movie called Field of Dreams, and the saying in the movie was, build it and they will come. And that's happening. That's happening here right now. But there's always a lag between supply and demand. If demand's there, you've got to wait for the supply. And the one of the things about property and why I find it so simple is that the law of economics is so in play in real estate. And when developers rush out and put too many sections on the market or houses on the market, we get oversupply and prices drop. When smart developers release things in smaller amounts, or wealthy developers, because sometimes that's an economical situation in its own right, supply demand's more balanced. So if you don't know economics, read some books on it. But the economic argument for Christchurch is very strong without giving an economics lecture. Demand's increasing, that increases supply. Yes, you get little pockets of oversupply and undersupply. And the economic argument for Christchurch, if you talk to an economist, is extremely strong. It's also the gateway to the South Island. I heard a stat last week as a keen skier that all of the ski fields in central Otago are expecting to be 50% down this winter because of COVID-19. Now, this is terrible to say this, but I've already told our family that we're going to ski more in central Otago this winter than Christchurch. As much as I love Christchurch, I believe that Christchurch's ski fields will probably have the same amount of people on them than they did last year, because people drive there from Christchurch, and over 500,000 people live here. If I do ski Christchurch, I'll probably ski the club fields, because I think Mount Hutt will be as full as it was last year. But Coronet Peak, Cadrona, the Remarkables, 50% down based on lack of international tourists. If they turn the Australians on, that might pop up. But all of the operators down there are planning and hiring for 50% less volume than last year. But at least they're turning the ski lifts on. So I know I'm going to get skiing in this year. And even if you're not a skier, it's also the gateway to the South Island from overseas and from Auckland and Wellington. Most people fly to Christchurch, drive, or Queenstown if you're a skier. But yeah, so it is the gateway to the South Island. Back to economics 101. This is a very cheap place to live versus New Zealand's other cities. So it's a livable city, but it's also a very economical city on your own pocket. Nationally, jobs are paid at similar rates. And Wellington CBD has the highest income per capita in New Zealand. But if you average out jobs across the board, nationally, all salaries are pretty much equal, varying the higher paid roles. But even then, a CEO in Christchurch gets similar to a CEO in Wellington, a CEO in Auckland, apart from the big one-offs like your banks or your publicly listed businesses. But if you look at a CEO for a council or a library or a commercial building business, similar rates. Same with blue-collar workers, white-collar workers. Nationally, jobs are all paid at similar rates. And what I'm hearing at the moment in the groundswell is that there are a lot of young people moving to Christchurch because it's cheap. And as more jobs come on down here, more people move down here. One of our our team who's on contract, he lives in Ireland, and he is from Wellington, and him and his wife are really debating whether they're going to move back to Wellington or Christchurch. And I reckon I'll move to Christchurch because it's so much cheaper for them to come down here, and their dollars for their first house will go further. So that is a great sign because it's obviously an increasing market. Economics 202. Now I'm just going to do something here. So I'm just going to quickly just check my questions because I like to have a look at those. I'm going to drink of water. Hang on 2 seconds. Right, replenish the vocal cords. So economics 202. So 101, basic laws of supply and demand. If you don't understand that, please buy an economics book, Google it. I think all property investors should understand three things to varying levels of degree of knowledge. Economics is actually probably equal with accounting. And accounting is boring. Economics can be boring. But if you understand economics and accounting, I reckon you're 70% of the way there. The other 30% is the law. You need to understand the law if you're going to be a serious property investor. But in that order, economics, accounting, even, law third. Those three things, if you understand those very well, you should be a very good property investor. If you're an emotive person and you don't know economics, accounting, or law, do not get into property. Apart from your home, being a bit harsh there, but I am generalising. Not my laptop. Excuse me. I normally plug it into a big screen, but I can't do that with these webinars. Okie dokie. So why isn't my mouse working? Here we go. So this is economics 202. If you study economics and understand it, these are some of the terms you'll hear. If you want to get into property, you need to understand it. Return on investment, ROI. Gross yield is the annual rent over the purchase cost of a property. Net yield is the annual rent less the expenses over the purchase cost of a property. Rental property is a yield-based business. Now, if you understand math and buy into this concept, which isn't a concept, it's a proven methodology of how property is valued. If you look at it as a yield-based asset and as a business, you're probably 90% of the way there, because it all comes down to the numbers. And valuers who set values on new builds, value existing builds, value homes, when it comes to investment property, they're retrospectively, did I spell that right? Retrospectively valuing on the capitalisation of rent. Now, some people will not know what I just said. So I'll repeat it, but it'll probably still won't make sense to you. But valuers are retrospectively valuing on the capitalisation of rent. Not all the time, but often they will. And what that means is that the rent level that you're getting for your rental can have an impact or dictate the value of the property, depending where it is in the market and a whole bunch of other things. But just as a general concept, rent actually has quite a big impact on value. So if we agree and buy into the concept that Christchurch rents are comparatively lower than other cities, and I don't think they're comparatively low, I think they're majorly lower, arguably Christchurch property is undervalued. So under-rented properties, if you know a property is under-rented and its price is set by the market sale in the location, you could be onto something. And it's quite hard to do that, and you need to spend a lot of time. You've got to be quite disciplined to do it. But a lot of serious property investors do that all the time. But if we look at the macro picture or the big picture and take cities, you don't need to do the math. I've already done it for you. Christchurch rents are comparatively lower than other cities, okay, and in a major way. Now, there's a lag of valuation to interest rates, and I won't go into this because this is deep economics, but interest rates are a very significant component on how property is valued, how prices are set. They're a really key part to everything because so many builders, developers, investors, homeowners borrow money to buy property. So interest rates are very much tagged to this, and without getting into a deep economical discussion about it, typically interest rates lag behind property values. And that can do two things. It can send them up and down, but then other things get factored into it, including supply and demand. So this lag with interest rates in New Zealand is far less relevant on value because we've got a housing shortage. So the supply perspective actually overrides the interest rate changes that we're getting, which are all going down. But in different market economies, dropping of interest rates could drop the price of property. But we won't go into that now. In New Zealand, that ain't happening. So if you do the capitalisation rates of similar properties model, you can actually find which ones are cheaper than or better value than the others. But I'm not here to show you how to do that now. I'm just giving you the fact that valuers use rent capitalisation to value properties, and it enables you to compare properties if you're using that method. And once we start bringing in some educational modules to our website, we'll explain all that in deeper detail. So let's pretend for a second that you buy into the fact that rent can impact the value of a property. Let's look at 303. Let's look at a property that's $500 a week, $26,000 per annum, pretty much average property. And it's being sold for $520,000, okay? So without getting a calculator on, the return on investment, gross return is 5%. And the what if the cap rate was 6%? So if the cap rate goes up, the property value goes down. And this is one thing that people struggle to get their head around, because a capitalisation rate is actually reverse of yield, but it's the same calculation. So if the cap rate is 6%, the property's now only worth 433,000. If the cap rate's 5%, it's worth 520,000. Now, if the cap rate goes down, the property value goes up. So if the cap rate's 4.5, the property value is 577,000. So that continues. Now, the most vivid example of this I can give you was a property in New Plymouth that I bought in 2000, early 2000s. It was a block of flats, and it had the same owner for a long time, and it had the same tenants for a long time. And in about 2 hours of an afternoon, when I was down there meeting some clients, I established that the rents for the whole complex were about 30% below market. Like, he was grossly under renting it, but he liked his tenants. He didn't want to chuck them out, and he was happy with his rental return. I thought, wow, this is, and because straight away I saw massive discount. I saw a grossly undervalued property just through the rental, because I understand this cap rate thing. And I thought, oh, this is exciting. And I was actually looking at it to use as a case study that night when I was meeting these clients. And I stopped doing that, and I went and put a contract on it. This is a true story in 2 hours. I put a contract on it. I think I put 20 days due diligence so I could do some homework. I talked about it that night with these clients. And I then literally won lotto, because the next day when I was back in Wellington at the time, I rang two valuers in New Plymouth and I said, what cap rates are you using to value residential property at the moment? And one of them said 6.2 to 6.5, and the other one said 6.5 to 6.7. And when I did the math on the market rental and looked at what the cap rate was on the current rental, this property was grossly undervalued on cap rate. So what that meant was that New Plymouth, and it was also comparative to Wellington, the cap rates were very, very high. So I thought, oh my gosh, not only am I going to get an increase in value through rental increase, cap rates typically flow from big centre to small centre. They haven't caught up yet with other locations. Now that also comes with demand. It's not quite as formulaic as, oh, okay, if Wellington goes up, New Plymouth goes up. The economics in New Plymouth have to substantiate that. But anyway, long story short, I think I paid 650,000 or 600 and something thousand for this property, or late fives. I did not spend a cent on it. I put the rents up slowly, and I got it revalued, and I sold it for 980 or 960,000, all through cap rates and under rent. And that's just economics. And it was a lucky find. Whereas I look at Christchurch right now, and I believe that's every brand new rental property. And I'll back that up with the fact that property managers in the city are very conservative, and they're not when new properties come on, the discrepancy between the rent for an old property and a new property is bugger all. Whereas if you go to Wellington, the discrepancy between an old property and a new property is huge, partly because tenants are now wise to earthquakes and old apartment complexes that are under the earthquake code. And landlords have had to pick their shoes up there, and they're actually charging less rent to keep tenants. But more importantly, tenants value their safety, so they're paying more for new property. So the quality of the accommodation in Christchurch is not really shown in the rental difference. People are paying similar rent for an old property than they are for a new property. We've got one project out towards the airport where the average price in the suburb is actually higher than the new builds that we're selling, which is crazy. So sometimes things don't make sense. And that's the great thing about opportunity. And the old Warren Buffett comment that I made at the beginning of this presentation, it's about understanding the math. And I'm now getting a little bit late. So that's my New Plymouth example. You might not understand this, but it is the science behind why people buy well and why people sometimes sell at a time. I didn't need to sell those flats, but when you make that, and that capital gain was in less than 18 months. So I just when I take a gain like that, I take it and I put that into 4 more properties. So for me, it's about I know, and I checked with the property because I know the owner. He was my property manager. I checked with him years later, and it hadn't jumped up that sort of jump again, and it wouldn't. So when you get an exponential gain like that, often it's a very good idea to take it. Now, if I was a long-term investor that just did investing and didn't trade, I would have held on to it, and I still would have won. But I can't help. I've been a trader most of my working life, so I'm both. I trade and invest. So that's a quick example.